The night after my husband's funeral, my daughter-in-law looked me in the eye and told me to pack my things and leave the house I had lived in for 32 years. I remember how quiet the dining room felt when she said it, like the walls themselves were listening, like the air had been pulled out of the room and replaced with something colder. My son sat beside her, his hands folded neatly on the table, his gaze fixed somewhere just past my shoulder, as if I were already gone. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I just nodded once, slowly, as if she had asked me to pass the salt instead of erasing my place in my own home. The smell of roasted chicken still lingered in the air, untouched on our plates, the same meal I had cooked for decades on Sunday evenings, the same routine that once meant family, warmth, belonging. That night, it meant nothing. I stood up carefully, pushing my chair in with the same quiet precision I had practiced all my life, and walked upstairs to the bedroom I had shared with my husband, the man who had promised me, more than once, that I would always be taken care of. His slippers were still by the bed. His watch still rested on the dresser. Everything looked exactly the same, except for the fact that I no longer belonged there. I pulled a suitcase from the closet, the old navy one with the worn handle, and set it on the bed. I folded my clothes one piece at a time. A sweater, a pair of slacks, a blouse I hadn't worn in years. I moved slowly, not because I was weak, but because I was thinking. Every word they had said replayed in my mind, not as pain, but as information. Every glance, every silence, every small detail that didn't make sense before suddenly did. When I walked back downstairs with my suitcase, they were still sitting there, whispering to each other now, their voices low but their expressions lighter, almost relieved. I paused by the front door, my hand resting on the knob, and for a moment I let myself look at them, really look. Not as my family, not as the people I had spent my life caring for, but as they were. Strangers. I gave a small nod, the kind you give someone you'll never see again, and stepped outside into the cool evening air. The door closed behind me with a soft click. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. They thought I had lost everything that night. They thought I was leaving with nothing but a suitcase and a memory. And I let them think that. I let them believe I was just an old woman with nowhere to go, someone easy to push aside, someone too tired to fight back. But as I stood on that quiet street, the porch light flickering behind me, I felt something settle deep inside my chest. Not grief, not anger, something steadier than that, something colder. Because the truth was, I hadn't lost everything, not even close. And the biggest mistake they made was believing I had. By the time I checked out of the hotel, the morning had already settled into a quiet rhythm, the kind that makes everything feel predictable, almost safe, if you do not look too closely. I placed my suitcase in the trunk of my car and paused for a moment before closing it, my hand resting lightly on the edge as I considered where to go next. Not because I was lost, but because I understood that every step I took now needed to be deliberate. I got into the driver's seat and sat there without starting the engine, letting my thoughts move through the details I had written down earlier, the timeline, the small inconsistencies that no longer felt accidental. Ashley's sudden interest in the paperwork after my husband's health began to decline. The way she had offered to help organize documents, her tone always polite, always careful. My son's quiet agreement, his absence from conversations he once would have led. At the time, I had chosen to believe it was concern, that they were stepping in because they cared. Now, the pattern was impossible to ignore. I started the car and pulled out of the parking lot, merging onto the road with steady hands, heading toward a place I had not visited in years. The office building stood just as I remembered it, modest but well kept, with a brass plaque by the entrance that still carried the same name. I parked, stepped out, and adjusted my coat before walking inside. The receptionist looked up as I entered, her expression neutral but attentive, and I gave my name quietly. There was a brief pause, the kind that suggests recognition, before she nodded and asked me to take a seat. I sat in one of the chairs near the window, my posture straight, my hands folded in my lap, and waited. The office was calm, orderly, the soft sound of papers being moved somewhere down the hall, the faint hum of a printer, all of it familiar in a way that felt grounding. When the door opened and he stepped out, older now, but unmistakably the same man, he looked at me for a moment with something like understanding already forming in his eyes. He did not ask unnecessary questions. He simply gestured for me to come in. His office was lined with shelves, neatly arranged files, a desk that held only what was needed. I sat across from him and placed the envelope on the desk between us, sliding it forward without a word. He opened it, read through the contents with practiced efficiency, and then leaned back slightly, his expression measured but no longer neutral. He expected this might happen, he said after a moment, his voice calm, almost matter of fact. I did not respond immediately. I let the words settle, not as a shock, but as confirmation of something I had already begun to understand. There are protections in place, he continued, tapping lightly on the document. More than they realize. I nodded once, slowly, my gaze steady. And they will not see it coming, I said, my voice even, without edge. He held my gaze for a brief second, then gave a small, almost approving nod. The conversation that followed was quiet, precise, focused on facts rather than emotion. What could be done? What needed to be documented? What steps would ensure that nothing slipped through unnoticed? When I left the office, the air outside felt different, not lighter, but clearer. I walked back to my car with the same measured pace, the envelope now joined by new papers, new confirmations, and a plan that was no longer forming, but solid. They believed they had already secured everything that mattered. They believed time was on their side. But as I sat behind the wheel once more, my hands steady on the steering wheel, I understood something they did not. This was not about what had been taken. It was about what had never been theirs to begin with. I did not go back to the house that day, not even to collect the things I had left behind, because I understood something clearly now that I had not allowed myself to see before. That house was never just a place. It was a stage, and they were already rewriting the story without me. Instead, I drove to a small furnished apartment on the edge of town, the kind of place that came with neutral walls, simple furniture, and no history attached to it. The leasing agent spoke quickly, explaining terms and monthly costs, but I listened only enough to sign what needed to be signed. $1,200 a month. Utilities included. Temporary. That was all that mattered. I moved in with just my suitcase and the envelope, placing both on the kitchen counter as if they were the only two things that still defined my life. The silence inside that apartment felt different from the hotel. It was not unfamiliar. It was empty in a way that could be shaped. I walked through each room slowly, touching nothing, simply observing, letting the space settle around me. That evening, I sat by the window with a cup of tea I had made in a borrowed kettle, watching the parking lot below as the light faded into dusk. I imagined what they were doing back at the house. Ashley moving through the rooms with confidence now, opening closets, checking drawers, making plans. My son following behind her, perhaps quieter, perhaps still convincing himself that everything happening was reasonable. I could almost hear her voice, light but certain, explaining what needed to be sold, what needed to be changed, how the house would finally become theirs. I did not feel the urge to stop them. Not yet. Because there was something more important than interruption. There was observation. The next morning, I made a call, not to confront, but to listen. When my son answered, his voice carried a hesitation he tried to hide. I told him I had found a place, that I was settling in, that I did not want to be a burden. I kept my tone calm, almost gentle, the way I had spoken to him when he was a child who needed reassurance. He relaxed quickly, too quickly, his words coming easier now, telling me that this was for the best, that I would be more comfortable, that they would take care of everything at the house. I agreed with him. I thanked him. I told him I trusted him. And in that moment, I heard it. Not in what he said, but in what he did not say. There was no mention of waiting. No suggestion that I should return. No pause that indicated doubt. Only certainty. Only relief. When I ended the call, I placed the phone down carefully and sat there for a long moment, letting the quiet return. Then I reached for my notebook and added more details. The tone of his voice. The choice of his words. The absence of hesitation. Each piece mattered now. Each piece fit somewhere. Because while they believed I had stepped aside, I had done something else entirely. I had stepped back. And from that distance, everything became clearer. Their confidence. Their assumptions. Their mistakes. They were already moving too fast. Already acting as if the outcome had been decided. And that was exactly what I needed them to do. The days that followed settled into a quiet routine, the kind that would have looked ordinary to anyone else, but felt carefully measured to me. I woke early each morning, made a simple breakfast, and sat by the window with my notebook open, reviewing what I had written as if I were studying something important, because I was. Patterns do not reveal themselves all at once. They unfold slowly, in repetition, in small choices that seem insignificant until they are not. By the third day, I drove past the house, not stopping, not slowing enough to draw attention, just passing by as any other car might. From the outside, it looked unchanged. The same white siding, the same trimmed hedges. But there were subtle differences if you knew where to look. The curtains in the living room were pulled back in a way I had never left them. The front porch light was on in the middle of the day. Small things, careless things, signs that someone was moving through the space without understanding its rhythm. I kept driving. Later that afternoon, I received a message from Ashley. Short, polite, carefully worded. She asked if there were any documents I might have forgotten to leave behind, anything that would help them organize the transition. I read it twice, then set the phone down without answering right away. Timing mattered now. Every response, every pause, every silence carried weight. When I finally replied, I kept my words simple. I told her that everything important should already be there. I told her that if anything was missing, I was sure she would find it. I wished her well. Nothing more. Her reply came quickly, almost too quickly, filled with reassurance and gratitude that did not feel genuine. But that was not the point. The point was that she believed what I wanted her to believe. That I was distant. That I was uninformed. That I was no longer involved. That evening, I opened my laptop and began to review financial statements, the ones I had access to, the ones that still connected to me in ways they had not yet realized. I moved through them carefully, line by line, not looking for large changes, but for small ones. Transfers that were slightly out of place. Payments that did not match their usual timing. Adjustments that suggested movement, not control. And there it was. A series of transactions that had begun quietly, weeks before my husband passed, and had continued with more confidence after. Not large enough to draw attention immediately, but consistent enough to form a pattern. I wrote each one down. Date, amount, destination. No assumptions, just facts. When I finished, I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes for a moment, not out of exhaustion, but to let the information settle into place. They were not just preparing to take what they believed was theirs. They were already taking it. Slowly, quietly, believing no one was watching. I opened my eyes and looked at the page in front of me. The numbers lined up neatly, each one telling a small part of a much larger story. Then I reached for the envelope again, the one my husband had left behind, and placed it beside the notebook. Two separate pieces, two separate truths. But together, they formed something complete, something undeniable. Outside, the night had fallen, the parking lot lit by a single overhead light that cast long shadows across the pavement. I sat there in the stillness, my hands resting lightly on the table, my thoughts steady and clear. They believed I had stepped out of the picture. They believed they were free to act without consequence. But what they did not understand was that every move they made now was not just a step forward for them. It was evidence, and I was collecting all of it. By the end of the week, their confidence had grown louder, not in what they said to me, but in what they stopped hiding from each other. It came through in small things at first. Another message from Ashley, this time asking about a piece of furniture she described as no longer needed. A follow-up question about whether I planned to keep certain accounts open. Each word was polite, carefully chosen, but underneath it was something else. Assumption, ownership, certainty that I would not challenge any of it. I answered the same way I always had since that night. Calm, agreeable, distant. I told her to do what she thought was best. I told her I trusted her judgment. And each time I did, I could almost feel the space between us widen, not as a loss, but as a strategy. That afternoon, I drove past the house again, this time just as the sun was beginning to set, the lights soft and low across the street. A moving truck was parked in the driveway. Not large, but not small either. The back door stood open, and I could see boxes stacked near the entrance, labeled in black marker. Kitchen, office, storage. I slowed just enough to take it in, then kept going. They were not just settling in. They were rearranging, reshaping, preparing for something more permanent. That evening, I received a call from my son. His voice was lighter than it had been days before, almost relieved, as if a weight had been lifted that he had not realized he was carrying. He told me they were making progress, that they were organizing things, that it would be easier this way for everyone. I listened without interrupting, letting him fill the silence with explanations he believed I needed. When he paused, I told him I was glad. Things were working out. I told him I was adjusting well. I even asked him if he was sleeping better. He laughed softly at that, a sound that used to mean comfort but now felt distant. He said yes, that everything was finally falling into place. When the call ended, I set the phone down and opened my notebook again, adding more details. The presence of the moving truck, the labels on the boxes, the tone of his voice. Each entry was precise, factual, without emotion. Because emotion had no place in what I was building. Later that night, I reviewed the financial records again, this time comparing them to the timeline I had created. The pattern was no longer subtle. Larger amounts had begun to move now, no longer testing the boundaries, but pushing them. Accounts were being accessed more frequently. Transfers were happening closer together. It was not just activity. It was acceleration. They believed they had time. That whatever they were doing would go unnoticed long enough to become irreversible. I closed the laptop and sat back, letting the realization settle fully. This was the moment I had been waiting for, not because I wanted it to happen, but because I knew it would. People reveal themselves most clearly when they believe they are safe, when they believe no one is watching. I reached for the envelope once more, running my fingers lightly over the edge before opening it again, not to read, but to remind myself of what was already in place. Protections they did not see, conditions they did not understand, boundaries they had already crossed without realizing it. I closed it carefully and set it beside the notebook, the two now inseparable in purpose. Outside, the night was quiet, the same single light casting long shadows across the pavement. I sat there in that stillness, my thoughts steady, my plan no longer forming but ready. They believed they were moving forward without resistance. They believed they were building something new on what they thought I had left behind. But what they did not understand was that every step they took was bringing them closer to something they had never prepared for. Not a confrontation, not an argument, something quieter than that, something final. The call came 2 days later, right on time, just as I had expected it would. I was sitting at the small kitchen table, the morning light stretching across the surface, when my phone rang and her name appeared on the screen. I let it ring once, twice, not out of hesitation, but out of control. When I answered, my voice was calm, steady, exactly as it had been every time before. Ashley did not waste time with pleasantries. Her tone was softer than usual, almost careful, as if she were stepping into something she believed required precision. She told me they had been reviewing the property records, that there were a few things they needed to finalize, and that it would be helpful if I could come by the house to sign off on some documents. I listened without interrupting, letting her explain it in her own way, letting her believe she was guiding the conversation. When she finished, there was a brief silence, the kind that often reveals more than words. I asked her what kind of documents. She paused, just for a second, before giving a vague answer about ownership updates and account access. Nothing that sounded urgent, nothing that sounded threatening, just routine adjustments, she said. I agreed to come by. Not immediately. Not that day. I told her I needed a little time, that I was still settling in, that I would come later in the week. She accepted without question, her relief almost audible through the phone. When the call ended, I placed the phone down slowly and sat there for a moment, letting the stillness return. Then I reached for my notebook and wrote down every word she had used. Finalize. Sign off. Ownership. Each one mattered. Each one fit into the pattern that had already been forming. That afternoon, I drove to the office again, the same building, the same quiet hallway, the same measured pace in my steps. When I sat across from him, I did not need to explain everything. I simply placed my notebook on the desk and turned it toward him. He read through it carefully, his expression unchanged but focused, and then nodded once. They are moving faster now, he said. I nodded in return. They believe they have control, I replied. He leaned back slightly, considering, then reached for a file on his desk and opened it with deliberate precision. Then we let them think that, he said. There was no hesitation in his voice, no uncertainty, only clarity. The plan that followed was simple, but not easy. I would go to the house. I would listen. I would allow them to present whatever they had prepared. And I would not refuse. Not yet. Because refusal would stop them. And stopping them now would mean losing something far more valuable than time. It would mean losing proof. When I left the office, the air felt cooler, sharper, as if the day itself had shifted slightly. I drove back to the apartment without turning on the radio, letting the quiet fill the space around me. That evening, I laid out the documents I already had on the table, placing them side by side with my notes, reviewing everything one more time. Not to memorize, but to confirm. There were no gaps, no uncertainties, only a sequence of actions waiting to unfold. As the light faded outside, I sat there in that small apartment, my hands resting lightly on the table, my thoughts steady and exact. They believed they were about to close something, to finalize it, to make it official. But what they did not understand was that this meeting they had arranged, this moment they thought would secure everything, was not an ending. It was the point where everything they had done would become visible, clear, and impossible to undo. I arrived just before noon, the same time I had arrived at that house for countless family lunches, but this time the air felt different, thinner somehow, as if even the walls were waiting to see how this would unfold. The front door was unlocked, just as it always had been, and I stepped inside without knocking. Ashley was already there, standing in the living room with a stack of papers in her hands, her posture confident, her expression carefully arranged into something that resembled politeness. My son stood a few feet behind her, quieter as always, his hands in his pockets, his eyes moving toward me for only a second before drifting away again. I closed the door behind me gently and set my purse down on the small table near the entrance, the same place I had used for years. Nothing in the room belonged to me anymore, not in their minds, but I moved through it as if it still remembered me. Ashley stepped forward first, her voice light, controlled, explaining that these were just formalities, just paperwork to make things easier moving forward. She handed me the documents and pointed to the lines where I needed to sign, her finger precise, almost rehearsed. I took the papers without speaking and looked down at them, not rushing, not reacting, simply reading. Ownership transfer, account access, authorization. Words that seemed straightforward on the surface, but carried weight beneath them. I turned a page slowly, then another, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make them notice it. My son shifted slightly behind her, his voice breaking in with a quiet reassurance that this was for the best, that it would simplify everything, that I did not need to worry about anything anymore. I nodded once, as if I agreed, as if I had accepted all of it without question. Then I set the papers down on the table and reached into my purse. The movement was small, almost ordinary, but it drew their attention immediately. I placed the envelope on top of their documents and opened it with steady hands, sliding out the contents and laying them flat beside what they had given me. Ashley's expression did not change at first. She glanced at the papers briefly, expecting something simple, something irrelevant. Then she looked again, slower this time. Her finger, which had been pointing so confidently before, paused midair. My son stepped closer, leaning in slightly, his eyes scanning the lines, his posture shifting as recognition began to replace certainty. I did not raise my voice. I did not explain everything at once. I simply turned one page, then another, aligning them carefully so they could see what mattered. The trust, the conditions, the restrictions that had been in place long before that dinner, long before they believed they had control. He expected changes, I said quietly, my voice even, without accusation. He made sure I would not be removed from anything that mattered. The room fell still in a way that felt different from silence. Not empty, not calm, just still. Ashley's grip on her papers tightened slightly, her composure holding, but no longer effortless. My son looked at me then, fully this time, his expression no longer distant, but